All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started as some other people filter in. So thank you everyone for coming out or staying at home and joining us for a virtual lecture, part of the Underground lecture series we're doing. You may remember from the previous lecture that Fort Negley was added to the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. We're pretty excited about that. And September is International Underground Railroad Month. So I want to go over our sponsors real quick. We're pretty excited to have as a sustaining sponsor Vanderbilt University. That's really helping us put this all together, as well as African American Historical and Genealogical Society, that Nashville chapter, Edgehill Neighborhood Partnership, Lipscomb University College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Ms. Sharon Francis, South Nashville Action People, Sons of Union Veterans, Camp Number 62, and Trevecca Nazarene University, Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Thank you to all of our sponsors for helping this, making this happen. So I'm going to turn it over to Angela Sutton in just a moment. She's Assistant Dean of Graduate Studies and Strategic Partnership. But I do want to mention real quick that Angela did a fantastic job getting 2 grants, not just one, but 2 substantial grants to create a Fort Negley Civil War database. So we'll be releasing more information on that soon. I'll probably put the link to the National Park Service one in the chat box at the end of that presentation, but I'll turn it over to Angela.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, I'm super incredibly excited to be able to database all of the people who helped us to win the Civil War, right? Like all of these Nashvilleans who didn't get to make it into the historic record, we're going to put them there. So it's an incredibly exciting time. I just want to reiterate a big thank you to our sponsors. It's a big testament to your hard work, Tracy, that we got such a diverse and wonderful group of sponsors to really help us celebrate this addition to being part of the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. It's such a big honor. It's just such an important designation for Fort Negley because it really shows how important this site was, not just the study of enslavement, but to all that stuff that comes after the resistance and the freedom and the rebuilding of a life, right? So that's incredibly exciting. But I'm here today to introduce to you Professor Jane Landers. She's the Gertrude Conway Professor for History at Vanderbilt, and she is the Executive Director of the Slave Society's Digital Archive. Now, this archive is one of the largest repositories for the study of slavery in the country, and it contains information of about 6 million individuals. So Jane was my mentor, so I've got really big shoes to fill. There weren't quite 6 million people at the Battle of Nashville, but we'll expand outward. We'll get everyone in. She's also the author of many, many things, but 2 of the things that you may have heard of, and if you haven't, you should get yourself a copy, is Black Society in Spanish Florida, and then Atlantic Creoles in the Age of Revolutions. Now, both of these books are really heavy on military history, really heavy on the history of enslavement. And these are things that are what we're going to learn about today. I'm so excited for this talk because I think often when we talk about the Underground Railroad, everyone thinks of going up, right? We run up, we run north, run to freedom in the north, go to Canada. But Jane is here to tell you about all of the people who chose instead to run south and why that would be. Why would you run further south in the time of enslavement? She's also worked with Fort Mose in St. Augustine, which is our nation's oldest free Black town. And I'm sure she's going to tell us all about that as well. So please help me welcome Professor Landers.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Metro Parks and Friends of Fort Negley for inviting me, and of course, Tracy and Angela for setting this all up and actually letting me be heard and seen today because I'm not very technically skilled at this. So it's a real pleasure. I've been going out to Fort Negley with my classes for a number of years now. And as Angela said, I've also been working with other parks in the United States and some around the world as well to try to bring people back into the histories, as Angela said. And so Fort Negley certainly deserves all the honors it's been achieving. It was Angela who helped me write the proposal that got it on the UNESCO Slave Route Project database, or excuse me, nomination, and also now this one. So these places that we're studying have some things in common. But as Angela mentioned, my stories start a little bit earlier, but set some precedents. So I put together a PowerPoint that I hope will carry some of this narrative for me. And we're going to start back with the beginning of this slave route southward that Angela mentioned. Okay, so let's see if I can actually make this work. La Florida, as they used to say in the Spanish terminology, was considered everything from Key West to Newfoundland and west to the mines of Mexico is how they would describe it. And so they didn't really know what it all contained, but it was a vast part of the Southeast and included what is today called Tennessee. And on those early explorations, as they were claiming all this territory, I just put up a quick list of all the people that were included in these expeditions, free and enslaved Africans, from 1513 on. So
sorry, Jane, can you share your screen? I think
I'm sorry, I thought I was already. Oops. I have to do that again, I guess. Can you see it now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, because we turned it off, I forgot. So here's a list of the expeditions that traveled all through these areas of the Southeast. And many of you may have seen some of the wonderful project called the 1619 Project, but I always try to remind everybody, Africans, both free and enslaved, were walking through and fighting through the Southeast from 1513 on. And these are just some of the expeditions that historians and archaeologists have been tracking through the Southeast. Okay, let's see. Oh gosh. I'm not seeing my own stuff now. Here we go. We don't know exactly where all they trekked. Archaeologists can find some of the materials left behind, and so we do know some of the relative locations of their routes, but again, all through the Southeast. And the first African that we actually know was involved in military service in the Southeast was an African man named Juan Garrido. We found a lot of his images in the Mexican conquest materials, but he really landed first in Florida in 1513 with Juan Ponce de Leon, and thereon joined all the other expeditions until finally he ends up in Mexico, where he leaves a written record for us as well as these art images of himself. So we know Juan Garrido, Black explorer, Black military figure, all through the Southeast. And then we get another settlement attempt in Florida, 1526. It's at a place that archaeologists think now is close to Sapelo. And I'm working with the Middle Passage Markers group. They're going to be putting a sign at Sapelo about this location of a failed colony as early as 1526, the Spaniards sent from the island of Española, which is today the Dominican Republic. And there was actually an African revolt at this site that we know very little about, except that the Africans left the mutiny that was happening there and went to live among the Indians. So again, we'll have to depend maybe on archaeology for that one. The next one that I tracked was 1539. We have Cabeza de Vaca going through all of the Caribbean, up through the west coast of Florida, all over the Gulf, and finally down into Mexico, again with Africans who left their records in the Spanish archives. And then Hernando de Soto, 1539 to 42, terribly brutal man who trekked all the way up to North Carolina, as far as North Carolina, with Africans in the expedition. And eventually he dies, is floated down the Mississippi River. But Africans continued the rest of the trek with the Spaniards. And an African-American woman is one of the survivors who makes it down the Mississippi finally to be rescued. So all of this history is pretty well not included in our US history textbooks, but I hope it will start to be. And let's see. And I started working on La Florida when I was a graduate student many years ago at the University of Florida, and I found records of shipwreck victims along the Florida coast. And this African man had lived 8 years among the indigenous people there, so that when the Spaniards first located him, he became a real political and military asset for them because he could translate, he knew the customs, he knew the terrain, and he gets put on the military payroll of Pedro Menéndez de Aviles, who made the final settlement at St. Augustine. So Juanillo was all through the Southeast as well as a military interpreter. And let's see. I found the first free Black militia in St. Augustine in the 1670s. And this man was not only free and a military corporal, but he owned a store in St. Augustine. So he left a wide variety of records. And I worked on a museum exhibit many years ago when I was doing this work, and the artists depict these people. We don't really know what they look like, but they are documented at least. There was also a convict assigned to St. Augustine from Havana, who eventually became free and was a real asset to them as well, because he was the blacksmith for the military in St. Augustine, and they critically needed him. And finally, as Angela mentioned about the Underground Railroad, when the Anglo system of slavery is introduced into North America in South Carolina, it's the kind of slavery that considers people property, and property ownership was more supreme than human life. And slaves began running from that terrible system southward because they had heard from the indigenous groups that there was a different religious and political system in the South that freed people and gave them lives that were quite different than those in the English colonies. And finally, a royal decree encouraged that flight southward in 1693. And we begin to see a significant group of men, women, and even children in canoes escaping from South Carolina and going to Spanish Florida. And so then the first free Black town that we talked about, or Angela talked about, it was called Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, and it was established in 1738 in St. Augustine, just a little north of St. Augustine, and it had its own free Black militia as well that helped defend the Spanish colony against all those angry colonists from Carolina who were trying to come back and get the slaves. We have several different artist renderings of this, and this is pretty well documented by archaeology, history, engineering, and map making. And because Fort Negley has such a distinct shape to it in the stone construction of it, it really reminds me a lot of the forts that were built all through the Caribbean by the Italian architects, the Antonelli family. And this is from a water view of the Castillo de San Marcos, where all the free Black militias of Mose also had regular contact and service. And the man who owned, or who became the titled captain of the free Black militia of that free Black town, was baptized as Francisco Menéndez. We don't know what his name was when he lived in the Gambia, or when he lived in Carolina, or when he lived with the indigenous people. We only get him written down in the Spanish records when he's baptized as Francisco Menéndez and put in charge of that free Black town. He almost immediately has military service of a very large kind, because in 1739, the War of Jenkins Ear, which was a global war between Spain and England, broke out. And this is just a scene of where some of the fighting was in the Southeast, but it's also happening in Panama, in Cartagena, Colombia, in the Dominican Republic, and other Atlantic ports. But here's our Southeastern battle scenes: South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And eventually, a big force from Georgia and South Carolina besieges St. Augustine in 1740, and the Royal Navy came up from Jamaica, those ships at the bottom, to also attack and bombard the city for a whole month under the command of General James Oglethorpe, who founded Georgia. And Francisco Menéndez had a key role in retaking his own free black town, and later serving also as a corsair for the Spanish in the Atlantic world. And one of the artists at the fort, at the National Park Service fort at Castillo de San Marcos, painted this image of what the battle was like at what the English call Bloody Mose in 1740. It's a little exaggerated probably, but the construction of the fort is pretty accurate. And Francisco Menéndez, the captain at Mose, who did all the military service that I mentioned, writes to the King of Spain and tells him all about the service he performed and is asking for rewards. When the king didn't write back right away, that's when Francisco Menéndez took a corsairing commission and also fights for Spain on the Atlantic Ocean. And Fort Mose was a wonderful place for me to get a start as a graduate student. And these wonderful people are the Fort Mose Historical Society that works to do many of the same things you all do at Fort Negley, to interpret and to encourage people to come out there and learn the history that has been untold before. So a very active group there, like the Friends of Fort Negley here. We also got some funds from the Black Caucus of the Florida State Legislature to do the archaeology at the site. And Dr. Kathleen Deegan was my mentor. So I've always paid a lot of attention to archaeology, and I'm hoping we'll be able to do the archaeology that needs to be done at Fort Negley too. These are some of the artifacts that were discovered at the site. It was an embattled site, as I just mentioned, and it was short-lived, but we find a lot of military artifacts, bone buttons, clay pipes, etc. And finally, the state made this a state park. It's also on the Underground Railroad. It's on the UNESCO and National Historic Landmark. And now we have a little visitor center like the one at Fort Negley with a little film studio and museums in it and so on. So they're very, very similar. And I hope you all will get to see Fort Mose's site as well. And as I mentioned, we were able to get it the designation, and Angela helped me with that. And then we did Fort Negley. And the military service doesn't stop after the war that I just mentioned. It goes on throughout the 18th century, because the next big military figure that comes into the Southeast is a man named Georges Biassou from Saint-Domingue, or what is today Haiti, who was a very important figure in the early revolution in Saint-Domingue. And when Spain is required to leave the island, he goes with the Spanish crown that gave him all his military titles, freed him, gives him property, and so on. And his house, you can see also in St. Augustine. After having fought all the wars in Saint-Domingue, he comes to St. Augustine, and his next military service is against the Seminole Indians, who rose against the Spaniards in the early 1800s. So he continues until his death, and he's buried in a military cemetery there with full honors. Everybody processed in his funeral, and he left a will and an inventory and so on. So we have a lot of documents on this figure as well. And it really interested me when I got to Tennessee, and I found the Toussaint Louverture Cemetery down in Franklin. That was interesting. Well, war goes on in Florida because the Anglos always wanted to take it. They never wanted to allow their slaves to run and become free in this territory. They needed to get the Spaniards out of there so that they could control it and have the kind of plantation slavery they always wanted. And so all through the 19th century, they're also attacking Florida and also sending in covert operations, one of which was in 1812. When we study the War of 1812, a lot of people consider only the Canada portions of the War of 1812, but Florida was a major part of the War of 1812 as well. And the British were hoping to retake everything. So they began setting up shop in the Gulf Coast area and training runaway slaves to serve as military allies of the British now. So we have British military loyalists, and we have Spanish military loyalists all of whom were at one time enslaved and made themselves free by either allying with the English troops coming back in 1812 or with the Spanish troops who still held Florida. And the US Marines invaded in 1812. And the free Black captain that I studied from this era of Florida in the book that Angela mentioned, Atlantic Creoles, was named Big Prince Witten in the English records. And then he is also later baptized as Juan Bautista Witten. He had a very important military career in Florida. And eventually, when the Americans finally do force the Spaniards out of Florida, he will help his community travel all the way to Cuba and reestablish themselves as free military figures in Cuba. And the next series of wars in Florida, the first Seminole War, which happens in 1818 under the leadership of Andy Jackson right near us. And so I put a little map up to show the sites of Black military operations in Florida during both 1812 and 1818. All the peninsula pretty much was a site of contestation. And then as I started looking at Andrew Jackson, because we're here and because he was also involved in Florida, I was interested in some of the free Black militiamen that served with him in the Creek Indian Wars after 1812. And then some of them probably also were with him at other times, but these were the ones I could document. And some of them show up in the Historic Black Nashville class we do. The gentleman in the bottom, Polydor, was one of the people that I got interested in because my next door neighbor, Larry McKee, was the archaeologist at the Hermitage and brought me some records to read in Spanish and translate for him. And it turns out that the man I had in my records as Fernando, who was a baptized Catholic, had escaped in the War of 1812 to the British, trained with them for years, and eventually is enslaved by Andrew Jackson in a battle on the Swanee River and brought up here where he became an important overseer at the Hermitage. So all of this history is very connected and fluid and also very militant. And the next big battle in which free Blacks served was at the Apalachicola River Fort. They called it in the American records Negro Fort at Prospect Bluff. And that is also a national park with a lot of interesting remnants of the fort that was blown up by the US Navy in 1816. But it was held by free Blacks who had run away from Anglo or English settlers. And it was fortified by the British who left behind when they left after the War of 1812. They left them cannons and ammunitions in this big fort. And the Americans didn't want that to remain in place. So the US Navy, again, in a covert operation, an illegal operation, if you will, because there was no war declared against Spain, they went up this river and blew up the fort. Some of the remnants of the people who actually survived that terrible shock of that explosion that was felt for hundreds of miles ran to the Black Seminole villages that I showed you earlier. And so that alliance between Indigenous and Africans is also something that threatens the Americans very much. And Andrew Jackson was one of those who ends up tracking all of those people up to the Swanee River in the First Seminole War of 1818. And this map shows some of the sites that are marked as Indian towns like Bowlegs Town and some of the towns that are marked as Negro towns because they coexisted and they were all allied, but they ran their own towns. And some of the leaders of those towns were people who ran from the Apalachicola River explosion to come up here and survive and deal again with the Americans later. So Juan Caballo is on the left. Abraham, who was another linguist and a very important political figure for the Black Seminoles. He had lived in Pensacola on the Gulf Coast before going to Apalachicola, before escaping to the Seminole towns. And he was an advisor to Chief Micanopy. And then on the right, he's also an advisor when the Seminoles go to Washington, D.C. to finally settle the Seminole Wars. There were 3 of them, very, very costly, expensive wars. And in the end, some of the Seminoles will run and remain in the Everglades to this day, and others are sent on the Trail of Tears, Andrew Jackson's Trail of Tears, westward to Oklahoma and Texas. And some of those ran across another Spanish border into Mexico eventually. So I'm working with the National Park Service people out in the West as well on that whole system of flight across borders, international borders, and how political the people came to be as they understood the difference in these systems. And then here's one more scene of another devastation in 1836 in the Second Seminole War. This was Abraham's town that I just showed you, Abraham. And we've done, I haven't, but other archaeologists have done excavations at this site. Terry White, who was also trained at the University of Florida by Kathleen Deegan, is the archaeologist of Pilaclicaja. And this was the Second Seminole War. The third takes place farther south in the middle of the peninsula. And finally, all of this ends in a Black diaspora, Seminole Black diaspora, because there are some little remnants in the Everglades. There are some who go all the way to the Bahamas and are received in the Bahamas. There are some that go westward and to Mexico, as I mentioned. And several years back, there was an Underground Railroad conference Diane Miller ran at St. Augustine, and all of the Black Seminoles from these various diasporas returned. So the folks that came back from Nacimiento, Texas, were Spanish speaking, in boots and hats and so on. The ones who came from Red Bay in the Bahamas were calypso players and so on. And the ones who remained in Florida and their descendants so each part of the community had developed differently, but they all had the same origins in trying to resist the Anglo control of the Southeast and trying to maintain their freedom under that Spanish system as long as it would last. So this is basically, we've zoomed through more than 3 centuries of Black military service in the whole Southeast that is not often recognized, but now with the Park Service's interventions and with UNESCO's interventions and the Underground Railroad designations and so on, I think we're going to have a lot more attention paid to these sites. One other one that I'm working with right now, another project, is the DeSoto National Park Service down in Florida, and they want to find out who were the Africans that landed on the west coast of Florida and trekked through, as I mentioned. So another one of Angela and my friends, David Wheat, from who was also a Vanderbilt graduate, is going to help me work on tracking the Africans in the DeSoto expedition, which need to be done. And one other one is up at Stono, South Carolina. There was a rebellion in 1739, the same year that the War of Jenkins' Ear broke out. And although the Carolinians tried to kill most of those people, executed most of them, some of them escaped and actually got to Florida. So over and over again, we see resistance against Anglo systems of enslavement. And the way they did it was through military service, either to the Spanish or later to the British in the War of 1812, but most consistently to the Spanish and also to the indigenous. So military service, a tradition that is centuries long in the Southeast. And that's my talk for you.
Dr. Landers, thank you so much.
Jane is fine. Thank you, Tracy.
Jane, thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I did have, we're going to transition to a Q&A part of the presentation. I was just, and I should prep everybody. If you have questions, you can go to that chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. That should be at the bottom of the screen for most of you. and just enter any questions you have there, and I'll read those out to Jane, or she should be able to see those as well.
Okay.
But one question I had is, what are some major differences between Spanish forms of slavery and Anglo forms of slavery?
Oh, and that's a great question, and I should have said it. The main differences are Spanish slavery was based on Roman law, and slavery was just a legal condition. It was not a racial condition, and it was not a permanent or perpetual condition either. So that even if you became a slave, there were a number of ways you could get out of it. You could be freed by the state for good military service. So if you fought pirates or you fought another enemy, you most likely would be given your freedom. Your owner could free you as a good Catholic charitable act, which happens a lot. And you could even buy your own freedom, work it out in the courts about what your just price was, and begin to make down payments, and you'd become free. So, and as I mentioned, it's not a racial system. So I had, for instance, a Spanish soldier who killed his wife and was condemned to slavery for a lifetime, it said, because of this murder. And I thought, oh, well, they probably wouldn't really put a Spanish soldier in slavery, would they? And yes, 10 years later, he was still working on that Castillo de San Marcos. So it becomes more racialized, like the English system, when you start to get big plantation crops, when you start to have, and you need a fixed labor system. So those are the ways it begins to look more like the Anglo system, especially once you get Andrew Jackson in there.
Thank you very much for that. One of the things you mentioned certainly created another question in my head is so that soldier who was enslaved for killing his wife, I assume he was owned by the state, by the Spanish crown, essentially.
So then, yes, he becomes what they call the royal slave. And those would be people that worked on the public works, like building buildings and forts and maintaining them. But also they had a galley system because everything's on the coast. So there would be, galley slaves as well in some of these time periods where they would have to man the ships and row the boats and so on. So wherever they needed them, royal slaves would be somebody condemned or that the Spanish crown purchased in Africa.
I think probably one of the biggest things I've heard, and you mentioned this earlier, is kind of the focus on Anglo forms of enslavement being the enslaver has all the rights go to the enslaver, whereas Spanish enslavement would have given at least some means for the enslaved to pursue freedom.
Yeah, they were
right.
property wasn't considered human, so if you look at the slave list of Anglo plantation records, you'll see lists of cows and horses and equipment and slaves, usually with only one name. And it's quite different, because even if you were enslaved, you're considered human with rights and all these social networks you're part of. Even your owners were part, and they would often be your godparents and help you get free eventually, so it's not all a wonderful system. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying it's more fluid and it's not permanent and it's not racial. And it happened over a vast area from everywhere from Florida to the Philippines.
I interject. I feel like that's something that I really learned firsthand when I worked with Jane and the archive, because when you look at these documents from the Spanish world, enslaved people had so much written about them, and there were so many ways to track them and to find out about their lives. And in the US, there really is this brick wall that comes when you're researching people who are descended from the enslaved, because right before emancipation, enslaved people were listed as objects. They were not considered humans by their enslavers. And that creates such a documentary problem. And that is really what we struggle with here in the US in a very different way, or I should say in the Anglo US, right? Not in Florida as much. So I really wanted to emphasize that because that's like a huge difference that we see between Spanish America and the Anglo-American states that we're living in. There was a question in the chat by Buddy Teaster, and the question is, how many free Blacks lived in St. Augustine, and can you make your images larger and not show the Q&A slide?
Is that to me?
Maybe make our faces larger and not show the Q&A slide? I think you can do that if you toggle the scroll between our faces and the Q&A slide. You should be able to slide that over and scrunch down the Q&A slide if you want to make that smaller. But the question to Jane was, how many free Blacks lived in St. Augustine?
Well, it varied, of course, because it's not a huge community at all. So there would be like 300 Spanish troops there at most. That was what they were supposed to have there. They didn't always have that many. And there's not really a census by year, but it's generally there. I think when I did try to quantify like that, there was 1 in 5.
And then Dr. Lee Williams has put a question in the chat as well. Dr. Landers, after driving I-95 from Savannah to St. Augustine, I was always struck by the geography of coastal Georgia and North Florida. Did most of the enslaved persons seeking freedom make their way to La Florida, travel by land or along the coast?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lee. And you don't have to call me Dr. Landers either. But yeah, that whole coast, it makes a lot more sense to grab a canoe and come on down, and especially if you had any indigenous guides with you. So there's a new issue of Slavery and Abolition just came out about maritime marinage running away. And I did the intro with one of the archaeologists, and I talked about exactly that it's much easier to go down those little coastal islands. There's a whole chain of them, as you know, and to work your way down that way. Some people did go overland, but that's a lot. You've seen those marshes and jungles and stuff. You wouldn't want to do that. It's a lot easier to go by the canoes and so on. And sometimes the Carolinians would, post notices about so-and-so left and took my canoe. And the first group that I found was 1678, I'm sorry, who it was 2 men, 3 women, and a nursing child even, and they made it to St. Augustine. So we don't know how many didn't make it either, because the English are always tracking them and trying to either bring them back or pay Indians to kill them. And
so there's a question from Gary Kohler. Was Andrew Jackson focused on slave recovery, native peoples removal, or land grab?
Well, I'd probably say all of those things. I think it was a mixed bag. It's very interesting. He flip-flops too. When he's in New Orleans, he does a speech about the fine Black military service of these troops that helped him there, that were already in New Orleans. A wonderful graduate friend of mine, Kimberly Hanger, wrote an amazing book and died very young, but it was about the Black experience in Spanish Louisiana. So we would always be in the archives together. I'd be doing Florida and she'd be doing Louisiana. The same patterns prevail all the way across the whole southern tier of our country, from the East Coast to the West Coast. And so archaeologists like Stan Deaton did Los Angeles. Afro-Mexicans established Los Angeles. Nobody knows that. And they did a whole Park Service exhibit on that, and there's a video for it. So it's pretty interesting that those experiences were there, and they've sort of been erased by the overlay of the Anglo system that came later.
There's a question about from someone who came in late about who was Chief Billy Bowlegs. And
Okay.
It sounds like they have a possible personal tie.
Okay. The Bowlegs family is a very famous Seminole family, and so some of their descendants are still in Florida, some are in Red Bays. I don't know if any actually went all the way out to Texas and Oklahoma, but that one map I showed you had Bowlegs Town marked on it up near the Swanee River. And, so we have quite a few records on the indigenous in the Spanish records that we don't get in the Anglo records either. Anglo records will sometimes have the chief or, an important figure, but the Spaniards often, traded with the Seminoles. In fact, my free black militia people ran the cattle trade in and out of the Seminole villages, and then they take them, the cattle to Cuba and sell it as well. So the other thing that I think is interesting about this possibility of freedom there is how mobile people became, because they're linked across the whole Gulf Coast, down into Mexico, down into Cuba, to the Bahamas. And again, they're not fixed in a cotton field somewhere.
Wonderful. What I have not mentioned yet, and I failed to mention last week, is we do plan to have these lectures available to view online after, most likely early next week. You should be able to access these if you missed anything.
Hopefully all that at the beginning when we didn't have any sound is gone.
Another question has popped up in the chat from Aylin. Dr. Landers, you mentioned Indigenous guides. What was the relationship like between slaves and the Indigenous communities? How involved were the Indigenous communities in the search for freedom for Black slaves?
Well, that's a great question too. And what the answer is that there were so many diverse Indigenous groups in the Southeast as well, that it varies from group to group. So some Indigenous people allied with the Anglos until they were seriously abused by them. And if they were temporarily at least allies of the English, they would track runaway slaves and try to return them. But before too long, you see that the English slave traders among the Indigenous also are abusing the Indigenous. And there's a major war in the Yamasee War, it's called, in Carolina. And that is one place where Francisco Menéndez escaped to the Yamasee first. They all fight the English. And when they're going to be defeated, they have to go down to Florida. So the Yamasee were allies, but others would have been trackers. And so you really have to, make a distinction between which Indigenous groups were allies of the Africans. And some Indigenous groups owned slaves themselves. Slavery was not an unknown system in the Indigenous world. And some of them buy into the Anglo idea of property and plantations and so on too. So it just varies by Indigenous groups. That's a great question.
It's sort of the same here in Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we need a lot more research on that, don't we? Well, when I was working on Polydor that I mentioned, Fernando, as I knew him, but he became renamed as Polydor. I said, the minute he steps foot on the Hermitage, everybody on that place knows about the Spanish system, about the wars of 1812, about the Seminoles at Bowlegstown. So he's like a walking encyclopedia of the politics of the day. And that means even people who can't read and have never been off that plantation knew so much more than we've given credit for.
Yeah, and then they brought that information to Fort Negley as they were building, right?
Exactly.
Amazing how everything just ties together in a neat little bow. All roads lead to Fort Negley.
Looks like all the questions that's popped up that I can see.
Okay.
So Dr. Jane, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
I enjoyed it.
It was fantastic, and we really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.